So it's busy recording. So welcome everyone to this fifth and final live session. So Jacqueline and I are going to co-present this. And we're starting off with just me by providing an overview of what this module is all about. And then Jacqueline is going to initiate the first few slides based on just a reminder of the Earth systems that are so important to the work that we're doing. And then also the importance of the built environment. You know, if you look at in the middle of the page there at the bottom, it says that the global average impact of the built environment and its operational uses. This is a very important concept. It's not only the initial construction, it's the ongoing operational uses in utilities, electricity, water, and so forth. So the built environment is estimated to use 18% of the planet's use of fresh water, 25% of the wood consumed, 40% of fossil fuels, and 27% of energy generated. So it's critical that we really try and reduce the ecological footprint or carbon footprint of the built environment. And there's many ways that we can go about this, as we shall find out in the presentation. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Jacqueline, and she's going to get going with the first couple of slides. Are you ready there, Jacqueline?
Yes, ready and waiting.
Okay. Right, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, it is quite sad that this is our last live session. So before we start on the built environment proper, I just wanted to take the opportunity to recap on the bigger picture, the Earth systems and functional cycles I've been introducing during previous live sessions as we go along, and according to their relevance to the module. So I've been adding a bit every week, and now we've come to the final session. And we can bear this in mind when we're thinking about how the topic of module 5 fits into these Earth systems. So we've been looking at how the elements of the biosphere are connected, and we've looked at the hydrological cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the nutrient and waste cycle. We've looked at the exchange of gases, which is enabled by life itself. We've looked at the food webs with the dependence of primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers, which are the herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, on the primary producers, which is plant life. And we've looked at the role as well that the decomposers play, the fungi and the living soil web, so that the Earth microbiome itself is always an essential aspect of biosphere functioning. Can I have the next slide, please, SEO? Right, thank you. And I've introduced the idea of how humans fit into these cycles. So we are 27% carbon. That's weight, incidentally. So if you weigh 100 kilos, 27% of that is carbon. If we're about 75% water, which is, of course, body mass. So inevitably, we are part of the carbon and the hydrological cycles. We're part of the exchange of gases because we breathe. We also have a very significant microbiome, the human microbiome. 90% of the genetic material in and on our bodies is microbial. And, you know, we have to ask ourselves, what does this tell us about ourselves? Are we a multi-species organism, like an ecosystem? A network of relationships with creatures that regulate our digestion, our metabolism, immune function, and even brain chemistry? Is this also a network of species so interdependent that none can survive without the others, including ourselves? Interesting questions about our place in the biosphere. Now, I believe we have a deep spiritual connection to nature, but there are people that would disagree with me. But even those who disagree with me on the basis of all this cannot fail to recognize that there is a profound physical interdependence with the web of life, which is now irrefutable. Next slide, please, SEO. Which brings me to the role we play as humans in the biogeophysical feedback loops that are manifesting themselves in the biosphere at present, deeply embedded as we are in that biosphere. The diagram here is becoming quite familiar. It has been used quite a lot over the last few months. It comes from an article which was published in August 2018, a scientific study. It concerns two possible pathways from which we can choose. I've mentioned two of the authors of the study before, Johan Rockström of the Stockholm Resilience Centre and Tim Lenton, climatologist and Earth system scientist at Exeter University. The article explains how all life as we know it at present evolved thanks to the relative climatic stability of the Holocene. Certainly, human civilization, as we know it, has evolved since the last ice age, thanks to that climatic stability. It made the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agriculture possible. However, our civilized human behavior has nudged this biosphere out of this climatic stability in two ways, through human greenhouse gas emissions and through biosphere degradation. Now, the latter one is very important for the trajectory we choose from now on. It's not just about emissions. So one path takes us to biogeophysical feedback loops that will inevitably tip the biosphere into hothouse Earth, in which life becomes impossible. The other is the choice for Earth system stewardship to a stabilized Earth through a human-created feedback loop. So it's important for us to accept the concept of feedback loops because it relates to the whole systems approach of ecological and permaculture design. Creating the appropriate biogeophysical feedback loops requires our recognition of the integral, adaptive part we play in the Earth system dynamics, as I mentioned above in slides 2 and slide 1. It requires, as the article puts it, a change in the fundamental role we humans play in the biosphere. And this then extends to all aspects of our lives. All the choices we make will have an impact. We've looked at how this works with the other 4 modules, and now I want to look at how this applies to the module 5 topic, green building and human settlements. So next slide, please, SEO. This slide was first introduced in module 1 in the book and in the link to the website over the Anthropocene. It's from Johan Rockström, co-author of the article above, and it shows the 9 planetary boundaries, 4 of which we have definitively transgressed. I introduced it again in module 3 when I showed how the biosphere integrity is being compromised by industrial agriculture, carrying us to what is referred to as the 6th mass extinction of wildlife, and how to transition away from that. This week, I want to look briefly at the land system change boundary. So that's sort of down where 9 would usually be if it were a clock. So land system change is implicated in agriculture and deforestation, but also in urbanization. If we continue to cover more and more land with concrete and tarmac, changing the land system use, we will be increasing our impact on biosphere integrity. We will be continuing to reduce habitat and forage for the diversity of species necessary for healthy ecosystems. So in the spirit of our Earth system stewardship, we have some tough choices to make, not only around the greenhouse gas emissions, but also around all aspects of bio-geophysical degradation. So how much more urbanization can we afford? Should we be building new suburbs? Should we choose new buildings or retrofitting existing buildings and settlements? Why aren't there enough houses for everyone? What role does tourism play, for example, in diminishing the housing stock in the form of Airbnb, hotels, holiday lets, second homes, etc.? What about all the shopping malls and stadiums and ski resorts and other leisure and sport activities? What about the business parks, warehouses for online shopping, roads, airports, rail networks? Where do we prioritize? Can we retrofit or restore existing abandoned villages, of which in some parts of the world there are rather a lot? Or should we be thinking about restoring and retrofitting urban buildings that are good for nothing else and turning these into urban eco-villages? How do these decisions align, and I think this is an important question, with the entire concept of regenerative cultures as we work with the social dimension of the Gaia education course and the economic dimension and the worldview dimension? We are aiming to create an entire regenerative culture. So these decisions obviously are going to align with all the work that we are doing in the other dimensions. So these are the choices we have to make from the perspective of our integral position in the biosphere, from our stewardship role, before we start taking about materials and energy. How much more urbanization can the biosphere stand before the bio-geophysical feedbacks carry us into the tipping point? The human-created bio-geophysical feedbacks that are part of our Earth system stewardship, as Rockstrom and Lenton et al. Suggested in the article, are connected with designing ecosystem restoration and repairing of the now dysfunctional functional cycles, and designing those into our own human ecology at every level, which of course is what we're here doing, talking about ecological design. And of course, this can be really very uplifting and an integral part of the regenerative processes. So I hope on that more upbeat note, I'll hand you over to Ezio, who's going to show you more of the potential solutions and some very imaginative ideas. Thank you, Ezio.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So this next slide we introduced in the very first live session, because given the important role of humans now in becoming stewards for the Earth systems, how can we go about that? Remember in the first session, we spoke about climate adaptation and mitigation, some of the key actions, or call them overarching approaches that we could undertake. But if we scan through this slide again, we will see that the built environment has got a significant contribution to make. Just looking at the enabling environment, this is what builds resilience and cuts carbon emissions. You know, we need to embrace whole systems, ecological design, green building standards is there, renewable energy policies, economic relocalization, energy descent planning. These are all pretty much influences on the built environment. Under adaptation, you can see the retrofitting of buildings, ecological sanitation, rainwater harvesting, sustainable urban drainage, renewable energies, urban greening, and your local organic food production around and within the city, but also around the edges of the city. Then under mitigation, these are more the global actions So we're talking mass public transport, decentralized energy infrastructure, new green build where necessary if we're not retrofitting. And those are basically all the built environment influences. Then obviously, as we get into agriculture, we ought to look at regenerative ways and agroecology, which are more carbon sequestration orientated. And also, very importantly, wilderness restoration. That's our zone 5 in permaculture. So let's see what, given this overarching approach, what we can achieve. So the key lesson, again, just to drum it in, is the comparison between a linear system and a closed loop system. Most buildings out there are linear systems. There's utilities coming in and waste going out. But we can actually close the loop and make them as closed loop approach as possible just by using a whole systems approach. And this is a nice example of a whole systems thinking for a typical building. And I can speak from experience how we've actually achieved this on some of the special schools buildings that I have mentioned in previous live session. Some of the special schools or special needs schools are for the disabled kids and the kids with learning challenges. So they have to have dormitories where they sleep at the school. And within these schools, they were using a lot of energy for the utilities, electricity, water, and so forth. But just by looking at the diagram that's there, we managed to close the loop in pretty much the same way. So within the schools, they built solar panels, they started harvesting rainwater, and all the sewage, instead of sending it in a linear system to the local sewage works, they created a biogas digester. And then the methane gas that was coming off that was enough to power the big geysers for the laundry and also the geysers for the hot water in the dormitories. So we invoked a closed loop system for the schools or special needs schools, and in so doing, we reduced the operational costs for that school and made it more sustainable. And the capital costs for doing that were not that significant. In fact, they were probably cheaper than had we just done a conventional linear approach. So the important thing is we can do this, and many buildings have indeed done so. And this is an interesting slide which shows green design strategies, and it's all color-coded to get our thinking along certain themes. So insofar as conservation strategies are concerned, it's all about insulating the building. How best can we keep cold air out, or if it's too hot, how can we ease it out? The pink there shows the energy strategy. So here we start looking at geothermal, solar, and so forth. Then there's also in the light green, the bioclimatic strategies. This is looking at the positioning of the buildings, the green roofs, the natural ventilation, passive design, shading with plants. In the light brown, there's waste management. What do we do with all the waste? We can compost it. And then we can bring in module 2 there for ecological wastewater treatment and rainwater harvesting. And then, but what about making the building appeasing to the end user or the beneficiary? So here we've got social strategies. How can we design something that enables personal fulfillment and the development of social capital? This is especially important for public facilities like sports and recreation facilities, libraries, community halls, youth centers, and so forth. So we design with the process in mind instead of the form in mind of the building. And I think the one box there that says architectural design for the soul pretty much sums up the social strategies involved in this green design. One of the important themes is that we've mentioned already for the special schools example is life cycle analysis. So if we look at the embodied energy of a building material, call it concrete or bricks or glass or structural steel or whatever, the typical embodied carbon, all the energy that's involved in the manufacture, the supply, and the construction of that particular building only accounts for about 35% of the total energy. We also call this energy. If we start adding the energy involved in the original capital works, and we add to it all the life cycle, the operational costs in terms of maintaining that building, we come up with a new word called energy, EM instead of energy. So the energy of the building looks at both the capital cost plus the operational cost. So let's have a look at the embodied energy here, or energy. The capital cost is obviously the construction or reconstruction, demolitions and so forth, the materials manufacturing and the transport and the physical construction. Then you've got the operational use. We've got hot water, we've got refrigeration, we've got heating, cooling, entertainment. All these ongoing life cycle costs account for about 65% of the building. So it's really important not to scrimp and save too much on the capital costs if we're going to make such a liability of the building in the long term. And one of the proven ways of reducing the initial cost, the capital cost, is to use as many local building materials as possible. So around the edges of the slide, you'll see, starting at the bottom, a nice little example of a cob building. There's also straw bale, there's stone masonry, and there's various types of colored earth that you can use in plaster rendering. There's bamboo construction, and there's also a really interesting roof structure called a reciprocal structure. You'll see there's no center posts because all the rafters lean on each other, and they are held together literally by the integrity of how they lean against each other, but also by a common ring beam around the edge of that building. And right in the top right-hand corner, that's a little training center which I built with a grass roof and pretty much a reciprocal structured roof structure in there as well. Now there's a handout in the additional notes that actually unpacks and explains all the different natural building materials. So it's really nice reading, looking at photos and some of the captions that actually explains how these natural building materials are derived. This slide here is about a whole systems design approach using biomimicry. So biomimicry, this pioneering architect called Nick Pierce, he designed a shopping center for a big pension fund in Harare, Zimbabwe, about 20 years ago. Now, if you can imagine where Zimbabwe is right now, it's pretty much a basket case of a country. It's almost been labeled as a failed state. There's constant interruptions of water, of electricity, and so forth. And I know firsthand that there's a lot of the buildings in the capital city of Harare that the lifts aren't working anymore. They have electricity every other day. So to actually operate some of these buildings becomes quite horrendous. But no one knew that 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was a thriving economy. And old mutual properties that built, they had to invest their money for the pension funds, and they built the shopping center. But they wanted to make it as sustainable as possible. So what Nick Pierce, the architect, did, he looked at how termites, and there's lots of termites in Africa, they build these huge earthen mounds. As you can see in the sketch, in the photo there, this is a big, big mound of termite. And it's all naturally ventilated. The termites create small little ventilation channels. And he looked at this and he said, why can't we create a building that mimics how termites build their termite nests? So in the great heat of the savannas and that, these termite mounds are naturally ventilated. So the hot air rises through the termite mound and the cool air comes in through the edges. And lower down here in the middle of the page, you can see a sketch of how the cool air comes in and the hot air rises and escapes. So that's pretty much the design of this building. It's got two long towers with an atrium in the middle, and the cool air comes in at the bottom and it displaces the hot air that's built up in the inside of the building, and that escapes through the chimneys at the top. So it's got a natural ventilating approach, and if you look at the bottom right-hand corner there, this is an extract from the website there. It uses 35% less total energy than the average consumption of 6 other conventional buildings in that urban block. And it's won countless awards for demonstrating how we can design with nature. And there's an interesting quote there by Mick Pierce. I'll read it here. Whether the building has begun to attain a life of its own since occupation is a matter of judgment. This was an attempt to design a building based on the metaphor of a living system, more like a termitory. That's the termite mound. An ecosystem is not a machine for living in. Sadly, it has been built for a shopping center, which is there as a mass consumption zone. But be that as it may, it's demonstrated that we can use biomimicry to build something that's resilient and pretty sustainable. There's this concept of that cities are basically heat engines. If you look at all the tarmac and the hard-built environment that absorbs heat, the average temperatures around cities, there's this heat bubble. It can easily be 3, 4, 5 degrees hotter than the surrounding green countryside. So how can we bring greenery back into the cities? And there's long studies being done about this, and the engineers also have to be reskilled. The typical engineer is what they will do with stormwater, they will pave it, pipe it, and pollute it. So what you have here as a consequence, every time it does rain on this hardened surfaces, the stormwater rushes off and it's not used in any meaningful manner. In fact, it clogs up a lot of the stormwater pipes, it picks up all the trash, and that all ends up in rivers. However, if we are able to design softer infrastructure whereby the stormwater is absorbed into the ground, and this can easily be done through car parks that have got grass paving blocks and small detention ponds where we can plant trees. Just having the slope of a car park directed towards small detention ponds, you can create little ponds and ecosystems around there, and that will support a whole raft of urban growth, of urban green growth. And some of the benefits of greening a city, you reduce the urban heat island, and you reduce the urban particulate pollution, and you also reduce the runoff and you increase infiltration. So it's very important that we start looking at urban greening simply to cool down these major heat islands of our metropolitan and city areas. And there is a classic example of Rio de Janeiro. I'm still trying to find web links about it, But I remember reading that about more than 100 years ago, when Rio was expanding very, very rapidly, it was all concrete and tarmac and tower blocks. The heat increased so much in the city that the city planners decided to plant millions of trees. And 20 years later, they had reduced the average temperature by about 4 degrees Celsius. So it can be done. And this is a slide from the second live session, just to remind us again the importance of sustainable urban drainage. It's not only the buildings that we're looking at, it's the urban fabric around it. And this is where we bring in the sustainable urban drainage. And the key lesson from this is slow it down, spread it, and sink it, and use it. Don't just let it rush off, out of sight, out of mind, down a pipe and into the rivers or into the ocean. How do we retrofit, or how do we green build? Here are some photos of some stone houses that you see. These are taken from Spain. And how do we retrofit these houses? And you probably find the conventional approach will say, shucks, you know, this is cold stone, you know, it requires major retrofitting just to insulate these houses. It's almost like an impossibility. How did the people 100 years ago, or even 40, 50 years ago, manage to survive a cold winter in these houses? And sadly, what's happened is that modernity has lost touch with how these houses were built and used. If you look at the photo in the top right-hand corner there, you'll note that the living area, just by looking at the windows, was on the first floor. On the ground floor, no people lived there. In fact, that was a stable. That's where the animals went. And the heat of the animals rose through the wooden floorboards and heated up the rooms above. And then similarly, in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a lovely wattle and daub structure. It looks in tip-top shape. But if you look at the ground floor, it's substantially less high than the first floor. And the first floor is where I imagine the people lived there, and also in the attic. But the ground floor was the stable. And you can see it's a lower ceiling height. And the animals lived there at night. They were taken into the village. And the heat generated from the cows and sheep and goats and whatever, and that rose again through the floorboards and heated up the house. There was no need for any major air conditioning or use of utilities. People just used animal power in those days, and maybe a wood stove here and there. So the important thing is, when retrofitting, go back and understand the original function of that particular building. Then this is a slide that we're repeating from the second live session. It's all about water. And the full slideshow has been uploaded to the additional notes. And just see how this whole network actually unravels. It starts with... Hello?
Θέλεις να δούμε μήπως μπαίνει ο φορτιστής σου. Και στο δικό μου.
Okay, I'll carry on here. So basically, this is a reminder of, from the second session, that a lot of the built environment revolves around water and sanitation. We need to embed these ecological approaches in the building fabric. And Harlow North did exactly that in this holistic design for an integrated approach to the infrastructure system. And it was all based on the design of not using more than 45 liters of water to be abstracted from the water table, because they felt that was not sustainable. So do have a look at your additional notes. where this whole slideshow on Harlow North is actually unpacked. So after many years, I started putting together something about the building blocks, or I called it the fundamentals of eco-village development. And I realized that in visiting places like Findorn and a few others, they pretty much developed organically as they went along. There was no grand plan of how things could be worked out a lot better. So after many years, there had to be a lot of retrofitting. So the best thing is start off by doing a holistic plan, a holistic design. If it's permaculture inspired, you'll get there a lot quicker. So that lays out the framework for how you do things. So this is very important. Start off on the right footing with a solid framework design using whole systems approaches. And in so doing, you lay out the zones of an eco-village or a small town or hamlet that works a lot better together than it would otherwise if it just happens slapdash. Then how do we plug in the important gaps within this framework? Obviously, we need to look at natural building systems. They've got low energy footprints, they're low maintenance costs, they use local materials, and you use vernacular design. Then we start looking at renewable energy with wind, solar, biogas, and biomass. Then ecological water and sanitation. Food security, local organic production is very important. And once you have these key elements, then you create the socioeconomic fabric for local employment opportunities, community facilities, educational facilities, little shops and markets, and for using a local currency to exchange for goods and services within this framework. So again, the important thing, get the plan right at the outset. You'll save yourselves a lot of retrofitting downstream. And these are some inspirations. Even you might be stuck one day in a suburb and you think, I can't get to an eco-village. Not everyone can live in an eco-village. But it's not necessary to escape the suburbs. Create your own eco-village right there where you live. And Dave Holmgren, this is the work that he's been doing recently. He's authored this book, Retro Suburbia. There's a fantastic video clip there that explains how this one street started working together and created virtually an eco-village using what they had. So people start retrofitting their own backyards. And look at what, on the bottom right-hand corner, what this homestead has been able to do compared to their neighbors who are still surrounded by tarmac and creating a heat island. And the important thing in this approach is that the human and social capital are vital to this approach. You need to speak to people, your neighbors, you get help from each other, and the camaraderie and the esprit de corps that develops is like the glue that we talk about in an eco-village. And sometimes I think some of these street eco-villages are perhaps more functional than what you would otherwise find in some of the better established eco-villages themselves. And at this point, I think let's just take some of these ideas and see how we can add value to them, and just through some examples of what I call ecological economics. Now, ecological economics, remember, it's the four capitals. It's the built environment, the natural environment, the natural capital, and the human capital, and the social capital. This is an example that we showed last week about renewable energies from the school. And I won't go into it in too much detail again. It's just to say that in this particular example, we harness the natural capital by integrating the rainwater harvesting. So all the rainwater tanks were connected, and they gravitated to a low point. And then from there, we pumped up the water to an elevated tank, and gravity fed down. This was our closed loop for water. The next thing we would do on this project is a biogas digester and also solar panels. And then the human and social capital is a permaculture school garden, which can have major outreach opportunities. So this is a nice example of using the 4 capitals. And here's another example in a theoretical approach of what we see happening in typical suburbia in South Africa and many other places in the world, mass public housing that ends up as dormitory towns because there's no economic livelihoods possible in these towns. It's just sprawling suburbia. And the alternative approach is to be more considerate about the layout, the form and shape of the urban fabric. Remember, going back to the eco-village fundamentals, if you get this planning right, it sets in place a whole lot of other things. So for example, you've got a lower servicing cost if you densify, typically like row houses. You've got more money to spend on a house because instead of on the road frontage in terms of services and that, you've actually got more privacy, you've got more functional space, there's higher densities, and moreover, there's higher economic thresholds. You use lower energy, and you could probably build a larger house in this environment than what you could in the middle of a site where you have to leave useless site space, as is shown on the left-hand side. How does this translate into an idea for a little spur of land? So on the left-hand side, we've got a little stream running around the edge of this little hill, and this is a typical conventional suburb with a little house in the middle of a site. We could recreate the same layout on the right-hand side, just using a bit more permaculture skills and a bit more creativity. So we densify the buildings, and we create more opportunities for market allotments, zone 5, and also public space in the middle. And you could see, where would you rather live? In this dormitory settlement on the left-hand side, or this more creative and vibrant urban environment on the right-hand side? Incidentally, both have got the same number of residential units, but one is more pleasing and dovetails into the built-in, into the natural environment, whereas the other one doesn't. Now, I took some of those ideas on this particular design project at Marikana about 10 years ago now. Now, Marikana is a place where all the platinum mines are in the northwest province of South Africa. You'll see the photo in the top there, that's standing in the middle of the site, looking southwards, and you see these mine tailings, these huge mine dumps of the residue from the platinum mines. And the challenge with the site, it's flat as a pancake, it's waterlogged, and it's surrounded by very unsightly mine dumps and mining operations, and it's right next door to an apartheid-era dormitory township. That's what you see on the top of the site here. So the mining company was London Mining Company. They own a lot of the platinum mines. They bought this land for their workers, and the commission to our planning team was they wanted about 4,500 housing units, and they wanted a concept design for a town planned layout. Their brief to us, it must be sustainable, and whatever it looks like, it must not look like the apartheid era township. They wanted something completely different and something that could be more amenable and to its workers. How do you plan this from scratch? So the idea that came out here was that in the middle of the site, there were a couple of ponds of water full of foul water coming from the mines, and we had to drain it. We had to drain this waterlogged area. So the idea was, well, let's drain it to the periphery here. We create a man-made stream that meanders along until it joins up an existing watercourse. And the earth that we'll dredge out in creating this artificial stream, we'll create an earth mound around the edges here. and plant our zone 5 of indigenous trees here. So by doing that, we would create a visual barrier so that the residents of this village here would not see these mine dumps and the mining operations on the southern and western side of their development. Then around the center, we said there is all the stagnant water in there, but let's dig it out a bit deeper and create nice water features. So this becomes the urban center. And then we have an economic corridor where you see it's shaded in red, and the typical streetscape there, lots of greening. And then the major intervention here was also the residential units. You could see the approach of row housing with their own urban greening, but moreover, the allotments that are immediately adjacent to the residential units. So here we've taken the classical permaculture zones as we know them from zone 0 to zone 5, or rather zone 0, which is the individual, and kind of extended this canvas over to a village approach where 0 is the individual. You have to make the conscious choice within you to embrace resilience and the whole systems approach. In the village setting, it's the people. So zone 0, your home dwelling, is extended to the village green and the town square. Your zone 1 becomes your social self-sufficiency, your commercial, public and entertainment facilities. These are in this red corridor and this green corridor running through the existing development. Then your zone 2 becomes your dwelling and homestead gardens, as you see in the sketch on the bottom right-hand corner. And then zone 3 is your allotments. And your zone 4 is the light green. This becomes orchard and passive open space where people can walk around here and run in the evenings or have their open space sessions. And then zone 5 is the natural environment. So here's an idea of how one can use permaculture design to influence the town planning layout at scale of a pretty large development. Sadly, what happened, this design was done in early 2008. And a few months later, we had the Lehman Brothers crash and the whole financial meltdown. And then this mining company simply said, sorry, they've got no money to build this village anymore. And since then, it's stayed as it is. It's quite tragic. But anyway, that's the story. And at least we are able to apply our minds and show that we can actually make a difference using permaculture design. Now, this next example, you've seen already from the second live session and also the third live session, but it's a continuation of this project. It's a case study. Now, we did this case study because it was difficult to influence the underlying developments that were happening. We had to almost move away from it and say, what if we could design a town plan from scratch? What would it look like? Applying our permaculture and regenerative design principles. So we came up with, we followed the water initially, did a rainwater harvesting plan, then we integrated the water plan with access roads in the forest belts, and then we looked at the permaculture zones, and that then influenced the town plan layout. But how do we use this? Because a lot of us are caught looking at or critiquing developments, but then not being able to take it beyond that. Let's just see how we can still help these, or rather provide more constructive critique against some of these developments. So what we have here is the permaculture-inspired idealistic layout. We then compared it with the current layout. So in other words, we superimposed one on the other. And we could see areas that we could influence and other areas where we could retrofit. So the comparative layout analysis or critique, this is what we did. And many of us are caught in this trap where there's a lot already substantial momentum through development approvals or community facilitation processes around new developments. How can we use our JETS-inspired newfound knowledge to critique these developments? And in this case, we overlaid an idealistic layout over the current reality, and we could see that we could influence the town center, as we have here with parks and a water body, and the village center and urban park that connects the public facilities and community facilities, rainwater harvesting at scale, forest belts for greening. And we could also influence the realignment of some of the roads that had still to be built. And we could definitely add value to the agricultural areas surrounding this town. So that's how we were able to influence on an advocacy approach, from using a theoretical approach and superimposing it over an existing reality. And another example of ecological economics, this is a classic. If you look at the sprawling shacklands in South Africa, especially around Cape Town and the Cape Flats, you actually wonder how on earth do people manage to get by there. But with a lot of, with an empowered human capital, where they bring some of the leaders in these communities to a workshop and they say, let's replicate an existing block that these people are living in, then how can we redesign it in such a way that we could provide more open spaces within this block, but by not eliminating any families. So this is an example of training of community, and as they started working together and coming up with their own solutions with a facilitation team of students and architectural lecturers and so forth, they came up with their own redesigned block. This is called shack reblocking, and these are some of the examples. On the left-hand side is before. You could see you can't even drive anything in here, emergency vehicles, there's nothing here. Whereas afterwards, they recreated it, the same number of dwellings, but you can see how there's more access ways, there's more opportunities within this urban fabric. And you can see some of the greening opportunities that have evolved out of it. And I think at this stage, I'm going to hand over back to Jacqueline. She's got a couple of really nice slides showing natural building examples. Over to you, Jacqueline. Jacqueline, are you there?
Yes, I'm now.
Okay, over to you then. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Before I go on to talk about these really inspiring buildings, I just would like to add one thing to what Ezio was saying about David Holgram's project, Retro Suburbia. Because I was in Australia a few years and I went to one of David's talks about it, and I also visited one of the case studies. It's the Ecoburbia case study with Shani and Tim Graham, and they have done such an amazing job on this. It is a really inspiring project, not only in the way that they have reorganize their own house into a small community of 9 people, and you know, the garden with their goats and the food production and everything, but also in the way that they have been drawing people from the street in to start the community building process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a couple of videos and links about Shani and Tim's project in the discussion forum for anybody who wants to have a look at this a little bit further, because there are just so many suburbs in the world. And, you know, I think it is a really great idea that we start turning suburbs into communities. Okay, now back to bamboo. I am sorry to say that I have actually never visited the Green School in Bali, which I think, you know, I hear from people who have been there, And I have seen so many of these pictures. It is a really quite special design. It's inspiring, spacious, bioclimatic buildings that allow us to live and work in pleasant ambience with light, the use of space, which can create intimacy, cooperation, and also a strong sense of the spiritual. And I think the great thing also about bamboo is it grows in almost any climate. And so you can grow your own bamboo. You can plant clumping bamboo, which is multifunctional as well. If you get the right species, you can actually eat the bamboo shoots, and your goats can eat it too. You can use it to build a bicycle shed or fences, all sorts of different things. It's a local material that just comes in very handy when you're thinking about low impact buildings. The next one, thank you, please. So this is Sadhana Forest Restoration Project in India. I took these photos myself. The one on the left was taken just after lunch, about 1 p.m., the hottest time of the day. And it was so cool in there, it was just beautiful. It uses local materials. It's a typical vernacular design built by people from the village. And as you can see, it is literally held together with string. It's easy to repair. It is such a beautiful space, the quality of the light, the breeze that blows through, coming from the forest, so the forest actually cools it down, and it feels very much like a cathedral. So these buildings can be absolutely amazing. I don't understand why people want to start building in concrete. Another thing about many of these vernacular buildings, and you can see that particularly also with the previous slide, is that nature is never really far away. There's a strong connection between exterior and interior, you know, similar to the whole Japanese concept with their traditional building, in which the garden is being invited into the house when you open the sliding panels, so that people are maintaining their connection with nature. The next one, please. This is Wong Sanit Eco Village or Ashram in Thailand. I also took these photos myself. I spent 6 months there a few years ago. On the left-hand side is the dining room. It was built by the inhabitants themselves from local mud, literally dug out of the ground on the project land, so that it was creating some of the lakes and the canals through extracting the mud for the building. They use a wooden frame, as you can see in the middle, similar to wattle and daub, and it's rendered with lime. It's very easy to repair, of course, because the materials are local. If it's wearing thin or it's been hit by the rain, it's just repaired with more local mud mixed up with straw. It's a 2-story building and it seats 50 diners, and it's already 25 years old. On the top right-hand side, you can see what they call the Japanese style house, which was the very first building that they constructed. It's constructed from native hardwood that has been beautifully polished on the inside to give a very pleasing aesthetic feel. And you can literally skate in socks on the hardwood polished floor inside. And I can confirm that because I've tried it. It has 3 stores, and it has a very beautiful central staircase in the middle, which uses a bioclimatic cooling by drawing cool air up from the lake and right the way up and out the air vent in that little peak on the roof. In the middle of the ground floor, or I suppose I should say the water floor, there's a type of sunken table also very Japanese style, and benches that is open to the lake underneath. So while you're sitting around it, your feet are literally dangling over the cool water, but also the air is drawn up through that central open space and up out through that little peak. You access it as well through a bridge, and there are glass folding doors that can be closed. So the interior and the exterior, that relationship is still always there. It's always present. And so you also have this feeling of being totally reconnected with the outside world all the time. The same can be said for the small house below that, which was my house, which was where I lived when I was in Wongsanet for 6 months. It's a traditional Thai style building, hardwood again, polished on the inside, walls of woven grass that are fitted into a wooden frame, and it breathes. And you really need that in places like Thailand where the humidity is very high. So the ceilings are very high. They're also for very beautiful woven grass on the inside, though the roof is modern materials because there are very heavy downpours there. The airflow is unrestricted under the roof, under the peak itself, because it's open on both sides. In a traditional building, that would be lattice, but here it was wire gauze, but nonetheless, you still can have that beautiful airflow through it. Unfortunately, what they have done is they have created more rooms downstairs on the ground floor. Ordinarily, this would be completely open. It would be the kitchen and the living space. And that's also quite important too, because it's very humid there, and they even keep their clothes on rails outside, because if you keep them indoors, the humidity makes them damp. So it's a pity that they decided to modernize that and put some extra structures on it, but I think you can get the basic impression. I've been to some really beautiful traditional Thai buildings that are completely open as living space downstairs. And if you go up into the jungles in northern Thai, then you get the very basic form of these, and the ventilation there is really so much better. But once again, the connection to nature is just amazing, and waking up and stepping out into this atmosphere is so good. At the top in the middle, there's one of the open kitchens, which are very easy to make. They are they're just made from mud. It's an outdoor kitchen, mud and straw with a thatched roof. The thatching is very easy to make as well. It's just palm fronds which are sewn onto a stick, and then each of these sticks is attached to a very simple metal structure with pieces of wire. You can see us actually doing a workshop on that, constructing one. It took us about 3 hours to finish it. So once again, easy, simple, can be repaired with local materials, open to nature, and using the bioclimatic strategies. Next slide, please. Just some examples of building with mud. People really think that you can't build with earth if you want to keep it for a very long time, or build big prestigious buildings, and that of course is a misconception. On the top left-hand side, you have the very prestigious Jenne Mosque in Mali, quite impressive that. Below, the equally impressive and prestigious Alhambra in Spain, which is also built from, I think it's rammed earth in this case. At the bottom, there is one of these very cute little cottages with a green roof, which insulates and cools. And this demonstrates what's referred to as the cap and boot method, for temperate climates. So when you're building with mud in a temperate climate, you can use these overhanging roofs, which will keep the rain from running down the walls, and also a layer of stones as a foundation, because that's the boots bit. They keep the water from rising up and getting to the mud. This, on the bottom right-hand side, you have this beautiful city in Yemen. It's 500 years old, local materials, bioclimatic structure that is structured in such a way that ventilation passes through all of the narrow streets. It's shaded, and once again, easy to repair. And just in case you really think that these are all in hot climates, the existence of these cob houses in Devon, in England, they're 500 years old. They're worth a lot of money now. Everybody wants to live in them. And once again, they were built to last. So, I have the next slide. Okay, these are, I think we're missing a slide. Ezio, I think we're missing a slide. Yes, this is the slide in which in the top right, top left-hand corner, this is David Holgram's house in Victoria on his project there. And you can see how he's designed it to maximize the passive heating from solar radiation in the winter, and a thermal mass wall inside, and the vegetation that grows in the summer to create shade. The vegetation also cools the air that's used for ventilation. You can see the inside with the thermal mass wall and some of the vegetation on the inside below that. Yeah, the slide has changed a little bit, so I've lost my place, never mind. So at the top right-hand corner, you have, in France, there are still people living in caves. They're also very popular as holiday homes. I've actually been in a cave that was inhabited up until recently. It's now used for storage. And I have to say that it was surprisingly pleasant. Apparently they have a very even temperature all year round, and it had quite a nice cozy feel to it. So living in caves might be the way, one of the ways forward. Below that, Clough Jordan Eco Village, the use of hempcrete as a building material. It's built around a wood frame, and I really think that hempcrete has a huge amount of potential. It insulates, it breathes, it's very easy to construct. It's a do-it-yourself construction material. It uses part of the hemp that isn't amenable for any other use, namely the stem, and then it's mixed up with lime. It can be rammed, or it can even be sprayed on. And I saw examples of this in Clough Jordan, which were really beautiful. And I also saw a house in construction at Tombreck Farm in Scotland, where they were actually spraying it on. And I'd never seen this before, but I was really quite impressed by how quickly it goes. So hempcrete is really, I think, worth considering and researching and thinking about as a very good future and sustainable building material. On the right of that, there is just a little picture of the way you can use cob, surrounds to a wood-burning stove to maximize the potential for the heat radiating outwards, so the cob will absorb the heat and retain it, and then it will radiate out slowly over a long period of time. And you can also build in seating and nice little nooks and crannies, and you can even make beds and sleep on it so that it's naturally warmed in that way. Below that, there's the basic design for the Earthship. I suppose that most of you have heard of Earthships by now. They are quite famous. Michael Reynolds, also known as the Garbage Warrior, gave up his practice as a mainstream architect to build self-sufficient houses in the Arizona desert using old tires filled with earth. And he also integrates other garbage like plastic bottles and beer cans filled with earth into the structure. The Earthships maintain heat, they catch and recycle water, they treat waste and recycle it round through the indoor gardens. They use solar passive heating and vegetation as cooling, solar photovoltaic, wind, etc. And they're really designed as being the ultimate survival house. Next picture, please. I included the Earthship here because I'm sure we don't all really want to go and live in Arizona in a survival house, but the design for the Earthship can be adapted, as we can see in this slide here, which they're all photos I took myself as well on a visit to some friends in who live in an Earthship in this eco neighborhood just outside Ulst in northeast Netherlands. So it was adapted specially by an architect for the temperate zone. It used old tires rammed with earth for the construction, along with solar passive heating for winter. It has some underfloor heating. Some of the houses do anyway, or mud-covered rocket stoves, as we saw also in the last slide. Some of them have quite luxurious bathrooms with mosaics and baths and double hand basins. Others just have showers that are still made of earth and that have been waterproof, but they all have compost toilets indoors in the bathrooms. I've actually slept in one when the temperature at night was below zero and hovered around zero during the daytime, and it was actually very warm and comfy and pleasant. There are 22 of the Earthships, and they were self-built with the help of about 1,000 volunteers from all over the world who came and took part in the project as apprenticeships. But they didn't come cheaply, because each of them cost around 220,000 euros, including the price of the land. They are lovely, but I still think that's a wee bit expensive. Next slide, please. There's another slide that's missing.
Sorry, Jacqueline, I thought these were the ones, the only ones that you sent. But this is the
last slide that I sent was a lot of examples of using dung in cob and straw construction, which I thought was very interesting because of the, the social implications of the way that animals become a very functional part of a bioregional economy, and even they become sacred because they have values beyond their meat and their milk potential, because the dung that they produce is very valuable in some cultures in Africa and in India as a building material for wall paintings, for roofing and for flooring because they can be watertight. So that sort of slide seems to have disappeared, but never mind.
Yeah, sorry about that, Jacqueline. I think I loaded up your front part of the slides, and somehow I thought that the balance were in hand. But anyway, I think we could post those as separate images on the discussion board. And as a final wrap up, we end up with a really nice image from the Transition Town movement, which shows a reflection at the bottom of the typical suburbia that most developers are caught up with. And what if we could retrofit? And that's the colorful example at the top. Using what we've got, you know, we don't need to go and recreate something new. We just retrofit what we have. So this fifth module is a critical module that wraps up the ecological dimension, simply because everything, us humans, we live in the built environment, and we need to create strong links with the natural environment and restore our earth systems. Now, how do we take all this information forward into the other dimensions? So we leave you with a bit of food for thought. We think that the ecological dimension provides a lot of tangible outputs for a JEDS-inspired design approach. And the next module that or dimension that you'll be doing is the economic dimension. So here, hopefully you can start really creating strong linkages between local livelihoods that can derive, where people can derive livelihoods from the ecological outputs. You've already done the social dimension, which can set in place the mission, the values, and all the ground rules for stakeholder engagement. And then the last dimension is the worldview. And this is the turning point. How can we turn this whole ship around towards a regenerative development approach? So we'll leave that there for you to think about as you start doing the other dimensions and completing your 4 dimensions. You then move into the design studio, where you integrate all 4 dimensions into a case study. So let's leave it at that, and we wish you well going forward to the other dimensions, and hope that we've left you with enough reading material and web links to keep you busy for a few years beyond the JEDS course.
And can I just round off as well a little bit, please, Ezio?
Yeah.
I just also wanted to say that some of the material I've been giving you about the bigger picture will reoccur in the worldview dimension, of course, because it is very important. And some of the material I've been giving you about being embedded in all of these functional cycles and the microbiome and everything are also, it's not just about recreating the functional cycles and the ecosystem restoration for the sake of nature, but because we are so deeply embedded in it, it is about also our own personal health, our own personal microbiome and the food we eat and the houses we live in that are healthy, that also have their natural microbes. So all of these things are much more deeply connected than we imagine very often as city dwellers that are very distant from it all, and tend to think that the microbial world is entirely pathogenic. So there's a huge amount for you to think about there and to carry forward into the next dimensions and to use when considering the social dimension that has gone, that can all be put together in that design studio. So I wish you all a very healthy, microbial and connected journey forward with the functional cycles of the biosphere.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm just scanning through the chats, and there's a very interesting question there from Nadia. Why has concrete taken over from mud? So I think I can... So my little one was telling me to go to supper. But anyway, this is a very interesting question. I'll read it out again. Why has concrete taken over from mud? And I've got a nice little anecdote about this. So basically, concrete uses cement. And cement is about 7 times, its ecological carbon footprint is about 7 times more than lime. Now, traditional building methods used to use lime. All the Roman aqueducts, the great old cathedrals that we see, those were all built out of lime. Now, at some point, one needs to build a floor slab. Now, traditionally, most of the floor slabs are built out of timber. Now, when you start replacing or running out of timber and you need to create a floor slab with lime, lime will take about at least 28 days to stiffen. And only after 28 days can you release the supporting scaffolding that holds the floor up whilst the lime dries out. So you can imagine a typical 4, 5, 6-story building using lime in the floor slabs takes a considerable amount of time. When they invented cement, cement takes 7 days to cure, and then you can strip the formwork. So because time is equal to money, it's a lot quicker to build with cement than with lime. And at that point, we started dispensing with lime and using more and more cement. And about 7% of the carbon footprint in the whole planet is derived from the cement industry, which is quite tragic. So we do need to shift away from cement as much as possible. And then another little anecdote is a lot of the warehouses that have been retrofitted or renovated alongside the Thames River. I've heard that generally you have to do a foundation test of these old buildings to find out whether you can use the existing foundations to build something new on top of it. And they discovered that up until about 1750, most of those old foundations used lime. Now, lime just gets stronger and stronger over the years. It's just one of these amazing products. So anything that was built before 1750, they left the foundations intact and just demolished the top structure and rebuilt another building on top of the existing foundations. However, after about 1750, a lot of those developments alongside the Thames or all over London and elsewhere, they started using cement. And those cement-based foundations are not as good anymore. So they've had to be replaced through piling and other sorts of geotechnical foundation techniques. So the reason is lime is definitely more environmentally friendly, but a lot of the developers don't use it because it wastes a lot of time, and time is equal to money, tragically. But thank you for that good question.
And in developing countries, you know, where I've been, like India and Thailand, and Haiti and places like that, you know, the people have been sold the myth of development and the myth of progress, and they really believe that having a concrete house is more prestigious, it gives them more status, and in many respects they're actually cheaper to build, though they're not as stable in many places. They shatter easily. A concrete house will shatter much more quickly in an earthquake zone, for example, and they are actually more easily demolished in earthquake zones than the traditional, not earthquakes, hurricane zones than the natural building, which would have used palm, because palm bends in the wind. I've heard quite a few stories about that as well. But yeah, unfortunately, it's prestige.
And then there's another interesting question here from Laura. Is the shack reblocking a type of retrofitting, and do they move the houses? And yes, shack reblocking is a type of retrofitting. They do indeed move the houses around, but they rebuild the houses out of similar material to the shacks, but a lot more sturdier. So a lot of the folk that are involved, there's architectural students that get deployed to these shack reblocking projects. So they work hand in hand with the community. They really cut their teeth at the coalface. And they come up with some very simple techniques. So for example, for a typical shack, it's got a wooden frame that's just pushed into the ground. Now, eventually that wooden frame is going to rot away into the ground and the whole structure then becomes pretty flimsy. How can they improve that during the retrofitting process and as they move the houses around? There's lots of spare tires around. All they do, they go and grab a couple of spare tires and they plant the structural timber inside the tire, and they fill that up with cement or a lightweight cement. So it's not going to get destroyed, it's more sturdy. So in the retrofitting, the houses are built a lot sturdier using what we call alternative technologies, which are all as natural as possible, but a lot more sturdier because here you've got students who know how to apply the technology as opposed to people who've just moved from rural areas and who are busy building a flimsy shack. Then we've got, I know we've gone, spent quite a bit of time on this live session, but there's a good question here from Rob Wheeler about just clarifying the difference between embodied carbon and sequestering carbon. So I think Jacqueline, if I could just answer this one quickly.
Well, we dealt with sequestering carbon in the agricultural, the local agricultural session. So I think it might be a good idea just to really look there because, you know, we go much more into the detail there. And I also dealt with it, I think, a little bit last week when I was talking about Tony Lovell's calculations. Basically, with sequestering carbon through agriculture, the intention is to encourage a type of agriculture with ground cover, which will put more humus in the soil. Now, humus is dead organic matter. And so you put the dead organic matter in there, and that is actually carbon, and it will stay there. Now, there are several different ways of doing it, like holistic and mob grazing, which mimics the natural processes of animals who live in grasslands naturally, like bison, or in Europe, the old aurochs. You can do it also with types of agroecology, which are no-till, but I'm trying to then just make this a very short answer because we've dealt with that in previous live sessions, if you don't mind, Rob. Okay. Do you want to take the one about embodied energy and embodied carbon?
No, I was just going to add that sometimes we also make a financial calculation, almost as if we've got a building using a linear approach where there's sewage waste going out that's got obviously a carbon cost to it. Whereas if you put it through a biogas digester and you're effectively sequestering carbon or reducing the carbon footprint. So it's also used in an accounting fashion to demonstrate the cost-benefit equivalent of better carbon-based solutions than otherwise. But I think there's no more pressing questions I've seen here. I think maybe, Jacqueline, we've already gone on about an hour and a half. I think we can wrap it up here then.
Yes, I think probably Gio wants to go away for his supper.
Yeah, and if there are any more pressing questions, please just send Jacqueline and I an email or post it on the discussion forum, and we'll do our best to get around to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we'll also try and post up some more information in the facilitators' handouts.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks to everyone, and I'm going to stop recording now, and we'll definitely stay in touch, and we'll keep each other connected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, and bye-bye, and stay in touch, please do.
Okay. Bye-bye.